snow blue and sharp across the flatlands, white dust stinging the few trees left standing along the ridge. It wasn't the kind of cold that made you shiver. It was the kind that stopped you from thinking, from feeling, from even praying. The girl didn't have boots. Her feet were blue, cut raw, but she didn't slow down. Not even when the ice cracked under her heel and she had to drag herself upright by the branch of a cedar so thin it bent under her weight. She didn't cry. Crying was for when someone might hear you. Ayana had been running since before sunrise. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't go back. The white men had taken everything. Her mother, her name, and now her baby was gone, too. They said she wasn't fit, that no Apache girl could raise a child, not one made with a white man. They gave no name, no grave. They just told her the baby was gone. And something in her chest tore open, not like cloth, but like bone. Caleb Dobson spotted her because the crows wouldn't leave. They circled low by the edge of his fence line, near the half-frozen creek where wild things sometimes died. He rode out thinking it was a deer, maybe a coyote too weak to fight back. Instead, it was a girl curled up like she was part of the snow. He thought she was already dead. Then her hand twitched. He didn't speak at first, just got down from his horse and pulled off his coat. She didn't move when he wrapped her in it. Her eyes were open, staring through him like he wasn't even there. He saw then her feet, bare, blistered, bones showing in one heel. She was too light when he lifted her, like a child who hadn't eaten in weeks. Caleb took her back to his cabin because there was nowhere else to take her. The town wouldn't help. The reservation was 3 days' ride, and she wouldn't make it. He didn't even know her name until the second day, when her lips stopped cracking and she whispered it like it hurt to say. Ayana. She was quiet, not the kind of quiet that comes from shyness, but the kind you earn after people have tried to silence you too many times. Caleb didn't ask questions. He just kept the stove going, left water where she could reach it, and cooked enough beans and bacon for two whether she touched hers or not. What neither of them said out loud was this. Caleb had once loved someone too, a girl with a stubborn streak and too many freckles. She died in childbirth 4 winters ago, and with her went every dream he'd ever bothered to shape. Since then, he just worked, mended fence, sold hides, patched the roof, and drank enough to keep sleep away. No one came by the cabin anymore, and that suited him fine. But Ayana being there, it unsettled things. Like a scab picked too soon. He found himself watching her when she didn't know it, studying the way she moved, the way her hands twitched in sleep like she was still running from something. Once, she screamed in her sleep, a sound so raw he dropped the tin cup in his hand. When he reached her, she was backed into the corner, arms over her head like she expected to be hit. Caleb didn't move. He just knelt down low and set the lantern on the floor. "You're safe," he said. "Ain't nobody coming." She didn't answer, but the shaking slowed. The thing about silence is it grows. Like moss. Soon there was nothing but it. No words, no questions, just small things. Ayana started boiling water before Caleb got up. She sort of ripped in his coat without asking. He left a folded blanket by the hearth without a word when the nights turned colder. Then one evening, she spoke. Her voice was hoarse, like it hadn't been used in weeks. "Why didn't you leave me?" Caleb didn't look up from where he was sharpening his knife. Didn't see a reason to. "I look dead. You look like you needed someone not to walk away." Ayana was quiet again after that, but the words stuck between them. Not heavy, more like a weight you forget you're carrying. Later that week, she stepped outside and stood by the fence. Caleb watched her from the porch. Snow fell quiet on her shoulders, and she didn't brush it off. Just stare at the tree line like she was waiting for something to show itself. After a while, she said, "They took my child." Caleb said nothing. There was nothing to say. Not to that. "I don't even know if it was a boy or a girl," she added, voice cracking. "They wouldn't let me hold it." She didn't cry then either, but her knees buckled and she sank down in the snow like her bones forgot how to hold her. Caleb walked over slow, sat next to her, not touching, not close enough to spook her, just near. The kind of near you give someone when you're trying to say, I'll sit here as long as you need. They stayed there long after the sky turned violet. That night, Caleb lit a fire in the stove and stared at the flames too long. His chest ached in a way that wasn't physical. He remembered his wife's last breath, the tiny form wrapped in cloth beside her. That pain was sharp and buried. But Ayana's grief, it cracked open something he thought he'd sealed for good. He wasn't sure what to do with it. The next morning, Ayana was already outside when he woke up. She was dragging a broken branch, clearing space by the edge of the field. Later, she asked for a small spade. Didn't say what for, but he gave it to her. He watched from a distance as she knelt in the snow and dug a shallow grave. No body, just a scrap of cloth she'd kept tucked in her dress. She placed it down gentle, like it weighed more than her own sorrow, and covered it back up, marked it with a stone. Caleb didn't ask if it made anything better. He figured she wasn't doing it for peace. She was doing it because someone had to remember. That night, Ayana sat by the fire without flinching. Her shoulders had relaxed, her eyes clearer. Not healed. She wasn't the kind to break then bounce back, but steady. Caleb poured her tea. Her hands didn't tremble when she took the cup. Neither said it out loud, but something was shifting between them. Not love. Not yet. But the beginning of something that could outlast the winter. A kind of knowing. Both of them had lost. And both of them, somehow, were still here. Ayana had never meant to survive. That much she understood clearly, even if she never said it. She'd crawled out of that place not with hope, but because her body had kept moving without her say-so. In the weeks that followed, as snow melted and the creek thawed into slow, muddy water, she started remembering more than just pain. Before the soldiers, before the mission school, before everything was taken from her, there had been warmth. The high cliffs where her mother used to comb her hair. Her brother's voice chasing deer with laughter that echoed off canyon walls. That was another life, and it came back to her in shards, not whole. Caleb noticed her gaze sometimes wandered like that, off toward nothing, like she was seeing people he couldn't. He didn't interrupt. He knew something about ghosts, too. Caleb had been raised in the same valley where he now worked and lived alone. His father had died in a sawmill accident when he was 12, and his mother remarried quick to keep food on the table. Caleb left home at 17 and joined a cattle drive going north. He never said much about those years, only that they taught him how not to get shot. By the time he came back, everything he used to know had changed. The town had grown, the old neighbors were gone, and his mother had passed 2 winters prior. His late wife, Annie, had been one of the few reasons he ever bothered with church socials. They met when she dropped a basket of preserves on his boot and didn't bother apologizing. He married her 5 months later. She died in a drafty room with a midwife whispering prayers and Caleb holding her hand, watching the color drain from her cheeks. The baby, his boy, never even cried, just came out quiet and stayed that way. Caleb buried them both under a juniper tree. He never let anyone get close after that. Not even the parson who came by, sometimes to ask if he'd like company. It was that same parson, Levi Trask, who came riding out one clear March morning, his horse cutting a trail across the thawing snow. Ayana was hanging laundry out back and froze when she saw him. She didn't speak, didn't move, just watched like a rabbit watching a hawk. Trask was kind, but talkative in the way men of God often were, always searching for something broken to fix. He smiled when Caleb opened the door. Just checking in. Been a long while. His eyes caught on Ayana before he could finish his thought. Caleb didn't offer explanation. She's staying here for a bit. That's all. Levi's smile flickered, but he nodded. Of course. Long as she needs. When he was gone, Ayana looked at Caleb. He'll tell them. The others. Caleb nodded. Maybe, but he won't run his mouth too far. She turned away, arms folded. They'll come anyway. And she was right. 3 days later, a wagon rolled into the clearing with a man Caleb hadn't seen in years. Emery Barnes, the local cattleman with a nose for gossip and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. With him were his 2 sons, strapping and smug. The kind of boys who like showing their boots off in saloons. Caleb stood on the porch, arms folded, as they stepped down. "Dobson," Emery said, tipping his hat. "Heard you got yourself some company. Word travels faster than winter ends." Barnes chuckled. "Just looking out for you. You know how folks talk. Apache girl showing up half dead. Staying with a man like you. Some people start asking questions." Ayanna was inside, but Caleb knew she was listening. Her shadow stood just beyond the doorframe. "You come all this way to share rumors?" Caleb asked, his voice flat. "No," Emery said. "I came to say folks might take offense. You remember the McCulloughs, don't you? Their boy was killed in a raid last year. They see a girl like that here, they might not keep quiet." "Girl like what?" Caleb's jaw tensed. Emery gave a thin smile. "You know what I mean." Caleb didn't answer. Just stepped forward till the boards creaked under his boots. "This land's mine. She stays as long as she wants. If anyone's got a problem with that, they can ride back the way they came." Emery glanced at his sons, then tipped his hat again. "Suit yourself. Just don't say nobody warned you." After they left, Ayanna didn't speak. Not that night. Not the next day. Caleb saw the way her hands trembled again while folding the wash. She'd stopped going out near the road, stopped standing near windows. He hated how familiar it all felt. Then came Rachel, the widow who ran the dry goods store down in town. She arrived on foot, cheeks red from wind, her dress trailing slush. Caleb met her outside before she could reach the porch. "I don't want no trouble," she said quickly. I brought supplies. Some food, some thread and cloth." He frowned. "Why?" Rachel looked toward the window, where Ayanna's shadow passed. "Because I know what it's like. Being watched. Judged. My husband drank himself to death 3 years ago, and folks still treat me like I should have stopped it. You don't have to explain anything to me." Caleb said nothing, but he took the basket from her hands. Ayanna didn't say thank you, but that night, she sat by the stove and sewed new buttons on Caleb's shirt, her hands steadier than they'd been in days. The world around them was changing faster than they could hold it back, and people were paying attention now. A woman like Ayanna, young and marked by both race and tragedy, was never invisible in a place like this. Caleb knew how quickly protection could turn to danger. A week later, Caleb found his barn door open. Inside, someone had slashed the sacks of feed. A knife stuck into the post had a message carved into the handle: "Savages don't belong." He burned the handle that night. Ayanna watched him through the flame. "They want me gone." He nodded. "I know. I should leave." "No." She looked up, startled by the sharpness in his voice. "You ran for miles through snow and blood. You don't have to run anymore. But I'm not safe here." Caleb swallowed. His voice dropped. "Neither am I. But we stay." It wasn't a promise. Not really. More like a shared burden. A choice to stand in the open and face whatever came. After that night, Ayanna stopped asking when she should leave. She started helping Caleb more, feeding the mule, tending the seedlings that would one day be spring vegetables. She was quiet, but not withdrawn. Caleb felt her presence differently now, steady, grounding. Sometimes he caught her humming when she thought no one could hear. And sometimes, late in the evening, she caught him watching her in the lamplight. Neither of them looked away. Not anymore. There was something between them now, not quite spoken, but real and growing. Still, the world didn't forget. And Caleb knew peace had a cost, and they hadn't paid all of it yet. The ground thawed slowly that year. Snow retreated in patches, revealing dead grass and muddy paths where the creek had overflowed. Ayanna took to walking the edge of the fence line in the mornings, her steps more certain, even when the wind still bit through her shawl. Sometimes she carried a small bucket, collecting broken twigs or odd stones. Caleb didn't ask what for. He just watched her from the barn with something strange in his chest, a kind of lightness he hadn't felt in years. She was changing, not in some sudden, dramatic way, but slowly like spring itself. Her hair no longer hung in tangled knots. She braided it in the morning now, always tight and even. Her hands moved with calm. She still didn't smile much, But once, when Caleb slipped and cursed after stepping in the wet ash pile, she laughed. A short, breathy thing, like she hadn't meant to. He turned to her, half shocked, and she looked away fast, but her cheeks stayed pink all the way through supper. It was the small things that shifted between them. Ayanna started leaving an extra biscuit wrapped in cloth for Caleb when he worked long in the fields. Caleb, without thinking, built a second stool by the porch and left it beside hers at the end of the day. Sometimes they sat in silence, watching the sky change. Other times, he'd talk. Not about his past, not yet, but about fence posts, the weather, the stubborn old mule. He didn't expect her to answer, but when she did, her voice was soft and steady, like she was testing the air again. One morning, Ayanna brought in a bird with a broken wing she'd found near the creek. She cupped it carefully in her hands, like it was something sacred, and laid it in a wooden crate by the stove. Caleb didn't ask questions, just watched as she splinted the wing using the tiniest slivers of wood and bits of thread from her sewing tin. The bird didn't fight. It just blinked at her, still and calm. She tended it for days. Caleb found himself checking on it too when she wasn't looking. By the end of the week, the bird flapped hard enough to stand on the edge of the crate. Ayanna carried it outside and opened her hands. It didn't fly at first, just looked around, confused, as if not sure it trusted the sky again. Then, quick as a thought, it vanished into the wind. When Ayanna turned around, her face was blank, but her eyes shone in a way Caleb hadn't seen before. That night, she sang under her breath by the fire. A tune he didn't know, in a language he didn't understand. But it carried something through the room, something warm, like an old memory, finding its way home. Caleb thought about reaching for her hand then, but he didn't. Not yet. Word from town came less often now. The parson hadn't returned, and the Barnes family kept their distance. But the silence wasn't peace. It was waiting. Still, Ayanna worked alongside Caleb without complaint. They patched fence, planted onion bulbs, laid out a new path to the well. One evening, Caleb caught his reflection in the window. The man looking back wasn't who he used to be. His shoulders weren't as slumped. His eyes, once dulled from too many empty nights, held something else now. He didn't name it, didn't dare, but it was there. A storm came early that spring, pounding the valley with wind and sleet. Caleb and Ayanna scrambled to tie down the shed roof before it ripped loose. She slipped on the ladder, and he caught her by the waist. For one heartbeat too long, they stood like that, close, her breath hitting his neck, his hand around her ribs. Then she pulled away fast, blinking up at the sky like it had done her wrong. Caleb stepped back too, jaw tight, saying nothing. The next morning, she left a slice of dried apple on his plate. Later that week, he found her kneeling in the field, smoothing dirt with both hands. At first, he thought she was planting something, but then he saw the stones, 5 of them, lined up in a circle. Not for crops, a memory. She didn't notice him until he crouched beside her. For them, he asked. She nodded once. My mother, my brother, and the baby. Caleb looked at the small center stone, the one she touched last. No name. She shook her head. They didn't let me give one. He looked down, jaw tightening. You could now. Ayanna was quiet for a long while. Then she whispered Tiva. Her voice cracked. It means dance in my language. Caleb reached out then, not to touch her, but to press his palm against the cold earth beside the stones. It wasn't much, but it was something. That night, she brought out a small piece of cloth and handed it to him. Inside was a carved wooden figure, a little bird, rough and simple. My brother made this, she said. It was the only thing I kept. Caleb held it carefully. You're giving it to me? I'm sharing it, she corrected. They sat in the doorway after that, shoulders nearly touching, watching the rain roll off the roof. For the first time, she leaned slightly toward him, just enough that her braid brushed his arm. It was enough. The days stretched longer. Ayanna began drawing things in the dirt, patterns, symbols. Caleb asked what they meant, and she told him bit by bit, stories, warnings, prayers. She taught him how to tell the wind's direction by the curve of the grass. He taught her how to saddle the mule and shoot a rifle, though she flinched at the noise the first time it cracked. "It's just wood and powder," he said gently. She shook her head. "It's more than that." He didn't press. They started riding out farther, checking fence lines, collecting firewood. Caleb took her to the old pine clearing where he'd buried Annie and the baby. He hadn't visited in years. Ayanna said nothing, just knelt beside the grave and laid down a sprig of sage. It wasn't her loss, but she honored it like it was. "I couldn't save them," Caleb said. "Not either of them." "You didn't let me die," she replied. "That's something." They didn't speak for the rest of the ride home. One evening, as the sun dipped behind a ridge, Ayanna stood by the window humming again. Caleb watched her silhouette, her hands moving slow, smoothing the curtain edge like it was something delicate. He stood behind her for a long moment, then finally said, "I think about you, even when you're not in the room." She didn't turn around, but her shoulders shifted, breath catching. "I know," she whispered. "I think about you too." When she finally turned to face him, her eyes didn't flinch. He reached for her hand, and this time, she let him. They stood there, fingers tangled, the warmth of her skin chasing off every winter he'd ever carried. No kiss. Not yet. Just the press of hands. Just knowing. Hope, Caleb realized, was a quiet thing. It didn't shout. It didn't come all at once. It crept in like morning light through heavy clouds. Soft and steady. And alive. Still, they both knew it wasn't over. The world beyond the creek still watched. Still waited. But for now, they had this. The firelight, the smell of earth, and the fragile peace between two people who'd once thought they'd never feel again. For now, that was enough. The peace didn't last. Spring deepened. Green pushed through the frostbitten fields, and with it came a slow but steady return of the outside world. Ayanna had grown used to the rhythm of life at the cabin. The scrape of the shovel in the soil, the soft breath of the mule before sunrise, Caleb's quiet steps across the porch. But safety, she learned, was never permanent. It only lasted until someone else decided you didn't deserve it. It began with a letter. Caleb found it nailed to his gatepost one morning, flapping like a dying wing in the wind. There was no name on it, just rough words scrawled in heavy ink. "We know what she is. You'll regret it." Below that, a crude drawing of a noose. He didn't show Ayanna right away. He burned the paper in the stove and spent the rest of the morning sharpening every blade in the shed. When she asked why he hadn't come in for breakfast, he just said he had work to do. She didn't press, but she noticed. That night, she didn't sit by the fire. She stayed outside longer than usual, watching the dark like it held some answer. Caleb stood at the door, unsure whether to call her in or leave her be. In the end, he stepped back, sat down alone, and let the room stay quiet. The next few days passed in slow unease. Ayanna spoke less. Her eyes were distant again, and she walked with a certain stiffness, like she expected to be yanked back into something at any moment. Caleb tried to reach her, to say simple things, offer help, stay near, but her silence grew heavier. Then came the rainstorm that broke the creek banks. They had barely enough time to pull the animals into shelter before water swept across the lower field. Caleb slipped in the mud, slicing his palm on a buried fence staple. Ayanna ran to him fast, pressing her hands around his to stop the bleeding. It was the first time she'd touched him since that evening by the window. "You need stitches," she said, voice tight. "I'll manage," he grunted. But when she tried to wrap the wound, he flinched, not from pain, but from something deeper. The feel of her hands on his skin, warm and urgent, opened a door in him he'd been holding shut. She noticed. Her gaze locked onto his, and for a long second, neither of them spoke. Then she stood and walked away. Later that night, with the storm pounding against the windows and the creek rising louder, she sat across from him and finally spoke. "I've been here almost 4 months," she said quietly. "I haven't bled since the snow." Caleb stared at her. uncomprehending for a moment. It hit him. "You think you're—" She nodded. "I don't know, but I might be." The room shrank around them. He set down his cup, hands trembling slightly. "You never said—" "I didn't know until recently. I thought it was the cold, the hunger. But now I feel it. Something's there." Caleb swallowed. "Ayana, if that's true, we need to—" "I'm scared," she interrupted. "I don't want to go through it again." The words came out brittle. Too fast. Too raw. Caleb leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You won't be alone. You can't promise that." He looked at her, truly looked, at the worry etched into her face, the quiet dread sitting behind her eyes. She had faced the kind of loss that didn't leave room for healing. She didn't trust life to give her anything good and let her keep it. And he was no better. He'd buried a child too. He knew what death could take from a man. He whispered, "No, I can't. But I'll stay, even if the worst happens." Ayana didn't answer. She stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the sky had gone black, the kind of dark that swallowed firelight whole. When she finally turned back, her voice was small. "I don't think I can survive another grave." Neither of them slept that night. Days passed. The water receded, but something had shifted. Ayana started having nightmares again. She never screamed, just woke up sweating, eyes wide, chest heaving like she'd run for miles. Caleb heard her through the wall, but he didn't go to her. Not this time. She hadn't asked him to. One night, she left the cabin entirely. Caleb woke to find the front door open and her footprints vanishing into the grass. He followed them, heart pounding, rifle slung over one shoulder. He found her at the stone circle she'd made, kneeling, one hand on her stomach. She didn't hear him until he stepped too close. "I don't know if I want it," she said without turning. Caleb's voice was quiet. "The child." She nodded. "I should. I know that. But what if it's taken from me again? What if I give my whole heart and it's stolen?" He crouched beside her, slow. "You've already given your heart. That's why it hurts." "I didn't mean to," she whispered. "But you were the first place I felt safe again. And now this life, it's tied to both of us." Caleb didn't speak. He watched her, waited. Then she looked at him, her eyes wet. "If I lose it, I need you to promise you won't blame me." "I won't. And if it lives, I need you to promise you won't leave." He reached out then, not to promise with words, but to take her hand and hold it against his chest. She could feel the heartbeat beneath. "I'm not leaving," he said, but it wasn't enough. Not really. 2 weeks later, town came knocking. Rachel, the widow who had once offered kindness, showed up with tearful eyes and whispered warnings. "There's talk again," she said. "Real talk. The Barnes boys saw Ayana downriver last week and told half the saloon she's carrying a half-breed child." Caleb's jaw clenched. "They're not just talking anymore," Rachel said. "They're gathering." "Caleb, you have to be careful." Ayana stood behind him, silent as always. After Rachel left, Ayana didn't speak for hours. Finally, she turned to him and said, "I don't want to be your burden." "You're not." "Yes, I am," she said bitterly. "You were alone, and people left you alone. Now they hate you just for sheltering me. I don't give a damn what they think." "I do," she said, voice cracking. "I care because I see what it's doing to you." Caleb grabbed her arms. "You listen to me. I've lived in silence for years. I've slept with guilt and ghosts. I was dead long before you ever showed up in that snow. You're not the weight. I am." She shook her head. "You think loving me is going to save you?" "No. I think loving you is the first thing that's made me want to be saved." Ayana's eyes spilled over then, fast, and for the first time, she didn't turn away from him. But fear still sat between them. She kept waiting for him to change his mind, to say it was too much, that she was too much. He kept waiting for her to run. And then one night, she did. He woke to find her gone. The blanket folded neatly. No footprints this time, just a note scratched into the table with charcoal. "I need to know if I can live without fear before I can ask someone else to." Caleb stood there for a long time, staring at the words like they might rearrange themselves. She was gone. He rode out the next morning. Tractor prints east through the ravine and across the ridge. He found them once, lost them again. He searched for 3 days, heart in his throat, mind full of every terrible thing that could have happened. But part of him knew. She wasn't running from him. She was testing herself. When he returned to the cabin, it felt empty again. But not like before. Not dead, just waiting. 2 days later, she returned. Her face was sunburned, her braid half unraveled, her dress stained with dirt. But her eyes were clear. "I went to the burial place," she said. "Well, they took my baby. I don't even know if the earth I stood on was the right one. But I needed to stand there." Caleb didn't say anything. He just stepped forward, slow, as if afraid she might vanish again. "I realized something," Ayanna said. "I can't live without fear, but I can live with love." She stepped closer. "If you still want me." He didn't answer with words. He just pulled her into his arms and held her like she was the only thing left in the world. And this time, she didn't pull away. They were far from safe. The world still watched, judged, hated. But in each other, they had something stronger than fear. Something fierce and quiet and alive. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to keep going. It was the sound of hooves that pulled Caleb from sleep. Heavy, fast, more than one rider. He rolled from the cot, heart already thudding, and reached for the rifle before his boots. Ayanna was already sitting up, blanket clutched in her hands, her eyes wide but calm. They talked about this, what they'd do if trouble came, who would go where, what to say, but none of that felt useful now. Outside, 5 horses stood restless in the early light. The men dismounting wore expressions that said they'd already decided the ending to whatever story they were here to write. At the center was Emery Barnes. He didn't look angry. He looked smug. "Morning, Dobson," he called. Caleb stepped onto the porch barefoot, rifle cradled but not raised. "You brought a crowd." "We just came to talk." "Arm." Emery smiled. "This is the West, Caleb. Everyone's armed." Ayanna appeared behind him at the doorway. She didn't speak, didn't hide, just stood there, back straight, one hand resting on the curve of her belly. Emery's eyes flicked to her. "Heard she came back. Funny how things get around." Caleb didn't move. "State your business." "You know what this is? People aren't comfortable with her here, especially now. You're putting everyone in danger, keeping her on your land. A woman like that, with a baby coming. Folks are scared." "Of what?" Emery stepped forward. "Blood. History. You think people forget the raids? The fires? Your neighbor's boy was killed on his own porch. Doesn't matter if she had nothing to do with it. She's a reminder." "She's a person," Caleb growled. Emery didn't blink. "She's a storm waiting to break." And suddenly, Caleb understood something he hadn't seen clearly before. This wasn't just about Ayanna. This was about fear. White men afraid of anything they couldn't control. They needed someone to blame for a world that was changing. And Ayanna was the perfect target. Young, native, female, unprotected. Only she wasn't unprotected. He stepped forward off the porch. "I buried my wife and child 4 winters ago. They died on this land. I've known death. I've lived with it longer than you've had clean boots." His voice didn't rise. It dropped low, solid. "And this woman behind me, she's the first person to remind me I'm alive. She's not a threat. She's not your scapegoat. She's mine." Emery's mouth twitched, unsure whether to laugh or spit. "You're siding against your own kind," one of the younger men said from the back. Caleb turned his gaze toward him. "You don't know a damn thing about me." "Then why her?" the boy asked. "Why not someone proper?" Ayanna's voice came then, firm and clear. "Because I know what it means to be buried alive. And he does too." All heads turned toward her. She stepped down from the porch slowly. Her dress clung to her from the damp air, but her chin stayed high. "I was taken when I was 14, she said, "by a preacher who said God told him to cleanse my people. I didn't know what cleansing meant until I bled. He told me I was dirty for surviving." Caleb's breath hitched. "They kept me locked in the back of a church for 2 years. No one asked. No one came. When I escaped, I ran barefoot through snow. My feet bled for days. And when I reached people who could have helped, they didn't. One of the men shifted uncomfortably. Another looked down at his boots. Ayana's voice didn't shake. I'm not ashamed. Not anymore. Then she looked directly at Emery. But you are. He blinked. You're ashamed that you were taught fear by men like you. That you'd rather believe a lie than admit you've never suffered. You've never bled for something. Her voice didn't rise. It burned slow, low, steady. Caleb watched her, his chest so full it ached. For a long while, no one spoke. Then Emery said quietly, "This valley's not going to forget." Caleb stepped forward again, rifle still down. "Then remember this. She stays. I stay. Anyone who comes past this line will answer to me." The silence that followed wasn't peace, but it was enough. Emery looked at the others, jaw clenched. Then he turned, muttering, "We'll see how long that lasts." And they rode away. Ayana stood in the road long after the dust cleared. Caleb joined her, slow, not speaking. He didn't touch her, just stood beside her until her shoulders dropped and her hand reached for his. Their fingers laced together, strong. Back inside, she sank onto the edge of the bed. Caleb sat across from her. "I should have told you sooner," she said. "About what happened. About the preacher. You didn't owe me that," he said gently. "I needed to say it. Out loud." He nodded. "I think part of me believed I'd always be dirty. That I'd never be allowed to be a mother." "Not really." Caleb looked down at her belly, then back up. "You're going to be a mother. One who fights." She gave a small, cracked laugh. "I've been fighting a long time." He leaned in. "You're not alone anymore." She looked at him, eyes filling. "I don't know how to stop running." "You don't have to. Not yet. Just rest." She nodded, slow, and leaned into his shoulder. That night, Caleb walked out to the tree where Annie was buried. For the first time in years, he spoke out loud. "I loved you, and I always will. But I think I'm ready now. To live again." The wind didn't answer, but it felt different, softer. When he returned to the cabin, Ayana was asleep, one hand on her stomach. Caleb watched her for a long while before blowing out the lamp. Outside, the wind shifted. Inside, a man and woman rested. Not healed, not whole, but no longer hiding. The worst had come, and they were still standing, together. The spring wind turned warm by the time the first shoots of corn broke through the soil. Caleb stood with his hands on his hips, watching the rows stretch in quiet lines across the earth. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open, and Ayana stepped onto the porch, arms folded beneath her belly, the morning sun brushing her face in gold. Her silhouette had changed, fuller now, round with new life. But what struck him most was the ease in her eyes, clear, still, and steady. Not free of pain, but no longer ruled by it. They didn't talk about the men who'd come, or the fear they'd left behind. Not anymore. The quiet that settled over the homestead afterward wasn't silence like before. It was something gentler, a kind of shared knowing. Like they'd both been stripped down to the bone, and what was left was just the truth. They belonged to each other now, not by accident, not from need, but from choice. It didn't happen all at once. Caleb kept his distance for a while, not because he didn't want her, but because he respected how long it had taken for her to claim her body again. Some nights, he woke from dreams of her hands sliding into his, the scent of her hair when she stood too close. But he didn't reach for her. He waited until the night she came to him. She didn't say anything when she slipped under his blanket. Her hand touched his chest, and that was enough. He turned toward her, the fire's glow casting soft shadows across her skin. He moved slowly, kissing her cheek first, then her forehead. Her eyes met his, wide and vulnerable, and she whispered, "I'm ready." He kissed her without hurry, holding her like something fragile but sure. There was no rush, no desperation, only breath and skin and the quiet way her hand clutched the back of his neck when she buried her face against him. They made love that night in a way that neither of them had ever known. Gentle, unrushed, honest. No ghost between them. No past to outrun. Just two people who had survived everything and still chose to meet one another, open and whole. Afterward, Ayana rested her head against his shoulder, her fingers tracing small circles along his ribs. Caleb lay still, one arm around her, the other hand resting lightly on the swell of her belly. I used to think no one would ever touch me again without taking something, she said softly. Caleb tightened his hold on her. I never want to take anything from you. I only want to give. She didn't cry. She just exhaled, long and deep, like letting go of a rope she'd been gripping her whole life. In the mornings, Ayana began humming again, sometimes in English, sometimes in her language. She told Caleb the meanings when he asked. Lullabies, blessings, prayers for protection. He started carving a cradle from scrap wood behind the shed. Not a fancy one. He wasn't that kind of craftsman, but smooth and strong. Ayana helped him sand it, her belly pressing against the wood as she leaned over. Girl or boy? Caleb asked one evening. She smiled. Doesn't matter. I know, but still. Ayana glanced at the horizon. I hope the baby has your hands. He looked down at them, rough, calloused, forever marked by the work of land and loss. Why? Because they hold like they mean it, she said. That night, Caleb dreamt not of graves, but of small feet running through sunlit fields. Time passed. Summer crept in slowly. The creek settled. The air thickened with heat and the scent of wildflowers. Rachel came by once more, bringing extra cloth and dried fruit. She didn't say much, just hugged Diana gently and nodded at Caleb. I've seen strength before, she whispered, but never like yours. Ayana smiled in return, and this time it reached her eyes. They built a little bench beneath the juniper tree where Caleb had buried Annie. Ayana had suggested it, not as a shrine, but as a place to rest and remember. When they sat there, she sometimes held Caleb's hand, sometimes didn't. Sometimes they spoke about the past, sometimes not at all. But it never hurt like it used to. Annie's name could pass between them now without breaking anything. In the evenings, when the light turned gold, they sat on the porch together, Ayana resting her head on Caleb's shoulder while he traced circles on the back of her hand. You ever think about leaving here? She asked once. Where would I go? Somewhere new. Somewhere where people don't remember who we were. Caleb looked at the valley, at the trees and hills that had shaped every season of his life. Then he looked at her. I'd go anywhere if you asked. But this place, it's not what broke us. It's where we healed. She nodded slowly. Then let's make it ours. The baby came in late August, after 3 long days of heat and thunder and pain. Rachel was there. Caleb stayed outside most of the time, pacing in tight circles, the sound of Ayana's cries echoing through the wood. Then came silence. Then the sharp, sudden cry of a child. Rachel stepped out with tired eyes and a wide smile. You got a daughter. Caleb's knees nearly buckled. He stepped inside to find Ayana pale, but smiling, her hair damp, her arms wrapped tightly around a squirming, red-faced baby girl. Ayana looked up at him, tired and glowing. She has your stubborn jaw, she said. Caleb knelt beside the bed, touched the baby's tiny fingers. Do we have a name? He asked. Ayana nodded. Tiva. Caleb's breath caught. You're sure? She nodded again. This time I want to say it out loud. And so he did, whispering it into their daughter's hair. Tiva. That night, after the baby had fallen asleep and Ayana drifted off beside her, Caleb sat on the porch again. The wind was soft. The stars scattered and bright. For the first time in years, he felt no weight pressing down on his chest. Only warmth and peace. Behind him, the sound of small breathing filled the cabin. He didn't know what would come next. He didn't know if the valley would ever fully forgive or if the world would ever stop drawing lines between people like Ayana and people like him. But he knew this much. She had run barefoot in the snow, and he had thought he'd never love again. And now, there was a cradle by the hearth, and a family beneath his roof. A quiet beginning, born from the ashes. And finally, at last, a place to belong.